Irish composer Donnacha Dennehy is here with me. He's going to talk about his new concert recording of The Hunger. It's with the contemporary music ensemble Alarm with Sound from Nonesuch Records. Welcome, Donnacha. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Brad.
Now, I've seen The Hunger referred to as a docu-cantata, meaning it's very much rooted in actual history, that being the Great Famine in Ireland during the middle of the 19th century. So maybe we can start with some history for listeners who may not really know just how devastating an event that was.
This is the famine that basically resulted in such a mass migration of Irish people to the United States. So actually many people who have kind of Irish heritage and they're not quite so sure from when, you might be actually able to trace it to this time, because 1 million Irish people emigrated to America, or emigrated from Ireland, mainly actually to Canada and America, during the famine. Another million died of starvation. And that was in a population of about 8 million. And then even as you went along, the country never quite recovered from that. So like about 80 years later, the population of Ireland was down to 2.5 million. So that was a country in serious decline, really, because of this event. And I suppose there's other complicating factors of, colonialism, etc. Because in a way, Ireland was a colony of Britain, and it didn't always work out to its advantage. And there had been famines before and there were famines afterwards, but this was cataclysmic in its proportions. Many people know of there being a blight on the potato, and so that's what happened. A huge segment of the population was entirely dependent on the potato for food. And once that blight happened, they had nothing really to eat. And there are kind of tragic components though to this, because actually many of the Anglo-Irish landlords continued to harvest grain, etc., and export it during the famine. In fact, exports increased during the famine. And of course, the tragedy there is that really the people didn't have control over the resources. There was a lot of charity. Even actually, there's a famous synagogue in New York that was one of the first to make a collection of around $1,000, which they sent. Native Americans actually made collections and sent to Ireland to help us. So it was one of the first sort of outpourings of global charity, but still it wasn't enough. And
Well, how important was it for you to write this piece? How long had it been sort of gelling in your artistic imagination?
It probably had been germinating in my artistic imagination from when I was a child to some extent. Yeah. And also I was kind of nervous of taking on the sort of magnitude of the topic, because it's a huge topic. And actually it's a topic that's very little addressed in Irish art. There's very little that's about the famine. And even in school, we only learn a little bit about it. We learn no kind of first-hand accounts. And I suppose I had been wanting to do something with it for quite a long time. But I found it difficult to find my way in, like, how do I deal with this? Until I came across these astonishing first-hand accounts written by an American woman called Asenath Nicholson, who made what now seems like extraordinary decision to travel to Ireland during the famine. She was living in New York City. She had a boarding house there to help poor people. And she traveled and she wrote about what she saw. And she was quite sort of stark in her descriptions. And I based then the main kind of narrative thread in this piece on her writings. But I mean, within me, I remember as a child seeing this amazing documentary by the BBC on Irish history. And I remember being really moved by the episode on the famine. And it's something that we all know. And actually then seeing famine memorials as a kid, where I saw these kind of like villages basically that had never recovered, broken down houses. There was something there in me that wanted to deal with it. And also I think because when people often think of art in Ireland, they often think of the theatre. And our writers like Yeats and Beckett and things like that. And you can definitely feel a kind of resonance of the famine in Beckett's work. But there's only one play that explicitly deals with the famine. And it's by a writer called Tom Murphy, a really excellent writer, but not so well known here in the States. And it felt like something that almost is too big just for words alone. And I felt that in a way, music could enter here where history and words couldn't do enough, because it's so suggestive in a way, and also the semantics are less clear cut. So there is a kind of openness to it.
I have seen and handled the black bread for months, and have told the story.
Well, you have two singers on this recording, soprano Katherine Manley, who for the most part sings the words of Asenath Nicholson, but you also have introduced the character of the man, the old man, and that is the sean-nós singer, Iarla Ó Lionáird. Can you talk about the two different vocal styles that you incorporated into this music?
Yeah, so Katherine Manley, is wonderful soprano from England, actually, sings the role of Asenath Nicholson, and she sings, almost entirely in English. There's one point in the piece at the keening where she breaks into Irish, and it's a way of showing almost that she has gone beyond she's crossed the threshold from just observer to being invested in what's happening, and that's where she kind of starts pleading for something to be done. And then Iarla Ó Lionáird sings this part of the man, which is a kind of invention of mine, because there's very little source material on those that actually suffered the most. And so I build it out of these kind of little fragments of sources, and he sings entirely in Irish or Gaelic. And I like that there's a kind of linguistic friction between the language of power in a way, which is English, and the language of no power at all, which is Irish. And that is kind of reflected in the music too. And of course, Iarla sings in this wonderful style, which is known as the sean-nós tradition. And it's a tradition I've known since a child. And I very much have built that into the fabric of the composition. And that even influences the way the harmonies work, and the kind of little hints of microtones that are in these consonant sonorities are all they in a way come from a sort of a marriage between this sean-nós tradition and my thinking of a kind of overtone richness in the sound.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the sound world that you have created in this music. I mean, there is that kind of folksy sean-nós music heard, but it's also, as you mentioned, using microtonality and harmonics. It gives it kind of an otherworldly sound to it. It's very striking throughout, but there's also a real sense of rhythm and a little bit of declamatory feel to some of the music. Can you sort of characterize what you've done musically in this piece to represent these characters in this event?
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right in your description of all those kind of components. In terms of the harmony, I often think in terms of the overtone series. So in every given sound, you have upper overtones, and I'm just sort of writing them out, as it were, in the sound. And actually, that can often produce quite consonant harmonies, because the foundation of tonality, in a way, is rooted in thinking of the lower overtones. But every now and again, of course, I add in higher overtones. In a way, they give it this bittersweet quality that exists between two worlds. And I kind of want that, because when I deal with the music from the sean-nós tradition, a lot of that is in a kind of major modality. But it slips between the notes, and that's what drew me to it to begin with. It drew me to it as an artist, and those kind of slipping, those notes between the cracks can easily be kind of, a light can emanate from them if you harmonize them with sound harmonies that are kind of infiltrated by overtone thinking. But also, you're right that there is also this kind of rhythmic propulsion in it, which gets more insistent towards the end. And I think of that actually as a kind of like just that almost like the machinery of the event, the momentum of the famine itself, that it goes beyond what people can do. Because, it's a complicated event, even though there's no doubt that colonialism was sort of at fault in making it this huge. It was the case that, of course, in the British Parliament in London, they were debating it like crazy, and they wanted to do something to it. They didn't want that all these people die, and yet they were They were, debating about free market and not wanting to interfere. And of course, that would have terrible, drastic consequences. So no matter what people were doing, there was still a kind of momentum in this event. And that's kind of the rhythmic insistence that starts to develop in the piece is in a way a kind of showing of this subtext in the music.
Well, there are plenty of dichotomies throughout the work, and probably the one that resonates the most when you listen to the piece is the music can be painfully beautiful at times, and especially when there's, an Irish text, and I certainly don't speak Irish. Listening to it, I was thinking, wow, this is really quite lovely to listen to. And then I read the translations, and I almost felt a little guilty for, thinking the music was so beautiful, but the text is so dire.
Yeah, the entire piece rests on that knife edge. That was a very deliberate sort of decision from me, from the word go, not to sort of paint catastrophe with the sounds of catastrophe in a way. And part of that, I felt, came out of a license from the sean-nós tradition itself, because a lot of the most beautiful songs in the sean-nós tradition are dealing with the most horrendous and almost catastrophic topics. And you get that too in pop music at times. The most beautiful melody, which is really about something terribly sad. And also I think of like the films of David Lynch, where you see something really kind of horrendous unfolding on screen, and there's a Richard Strauss song or something, and it's so beautiful. And there, I felt that was kind of essential for allowing an openness, because if all the systems, like the music and the text and all these things, are agreeing on the same emotion, it doesn't allow us any room in as a listener. And I think we can invest more when, in a way, there's a slight dissonance, as it were, between the messages of each element. And I went for a kind of, there's a line from W.B. Yeats, "A terrible beauty is born." And that line stuck in my head a lot, a terrible beauty. And that seems to me really deep in the kind of Irish tradition as well. And it's weird, and I used it in a kind of a sort of a more, if you want, avant-garde interpretation of that, because even the use of the overtones is to produce this kind of almost luminous harmony. A luminous harmony, though, that's on the edge between being beautiful and bitter.
Well, the ending of the piece is so powerful, and it resonates, I think, even in our present time, with words from Asenath Nicholson asking where the men of moral, spiritual might, and seeing the graves of martyrs across the channel. It's lamenting that nobody is coming to the aid of Ireland. And there's a little, I sense a little tinge of anger in the final interaction between the two singers, where they're talking about this sorrow.
Absolutely. The piece turns at the very end. It turns at the very end into a kind of resistance. And I do it quite fast, and then the piece is over. And because I didn't want to hammer that home necessarily, but yes, you really feel that suddenly it's not, when they say a trua, mean a pity, it's not a pity in a kind of melancholic way, but laced with a kind of bitterness that this could come to pass, you know? And there's no doubt, and I'm thinking all the time of the parallels in today's society. And in fact, in the stage show, some of that is made more explicit by these commentators who are video inserts that come in against the music. You can think of things that are happening the way, so I live here now in America, and I love living in America, but when you think of the question of how immigrants are discussed here, it can be dehumanizing. It is dehumanizing, and there is this idea of the other, and that is completely where the Irish were at in the middle of the 19th century. They were the other, and so they weren't quite human. There was a way of maybe. I mean, there were some horrendous things written in journals of British officials, in charge of this. Like, it was kind of like, well, maybe, it's God's will that this should come to pass, kind of, and that thinking is still all around us, I'm afraid.
It's very thought-provoking for today's times as well. You mentioned the stage version of it, and I know this originally began as more of an opera than the cantata version that's represented on the new recording. Can you talk about the differences between the two? Do they end the same way?
No, they end differently. So the stage version is longer. It's about an hour and 8 minutes or so, or hour and 10 minutes. And there is a whole new section which involves a source recording that comes in as well, of a man singing about his blackthorn bush and how the fruit at the bottom is sweet and that at the top is bitter. But it is also in the stage version, there's kind of what I call like a Greek chorus, although they're not all in unison for sure. There are little contradictions between them, of 5 commentators who are philosophers or economists, and they're Noam Chomsky, Paul Krugman, Megan Vaughan, she's a terrific historian of colonialism in London, Maureen Murphy, who's Asenath's biographer, and Branko Milanovic, who's an expert on inequality. And they just, me and the director sent them all a list of questions, the same questions, to see how they would answer them, to deal with the kind of underpinnings of the famine, the fact that there was the theory of laissez-faire economics, which was to not interfere with the workings of the market, which of course had disastrous consequences in the case of the Irish famine, and questions of colonialism and questions of inequality today. And so there's just a few. Actually, I had more video in the original version of the stage, and now I've cut it down. I've cut about a quarter out, actually. So I feel that actually it really kind of is quite taut now, and they that is intercut against this unfolding narrative of Asenath and the man in the stage version. And we just did it in Dublin, actually, in August, and it was quite profound, the impact, the resonance that it seemed to have there. Actually, I was quite moved by that, actually.
Well, the concert version, this recording, is in 5 different movements, and I want to talk about the movement in the middle, Black Potatoes, because listening to it, it seems like it's a lament, but it's also a prayer. The music is declamatory, as we've talked about, but it's also unresolved until the end. You've sort of got dominant harmonies juxtaposed, with the tonic. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's not until the very end that it finally resolves.
Yeah, and when it resolves at the end, it resolves into a huge overtone harmony based on D. So it might feel like it's a D harmony, but it's got all these upper partials in the sound. And actually, I think of that whole piece, in terms of the way the harmony develops, as that kind of overtone harmony which gradually eats the whole way through that song, as being like almost a kind of a blight in the music, even though it produces this kind of radiant but unsettled sound. One of the inspirations for that movement within the piece is a song called Na Prátaí Dubha, which translates as Black Potatoes, and that's the melodic material that Iarla sings and the words are based from that sean-nós song, and that is one of the very few sean-nós songs that comes from the time of the famine. There was very little written in the famine time. There was a great song collector of the time called George Petrie, who said there was an awful unwonted silence. And basically, I mean, this, I don't want to be dramatic, but people were basically too weak to be doing music or anything, which is kind of extraordinary in Ireland because there's music everywhere if you've ever been. And this is a song, and this was written, the words of this were written by a woman called Maureen Ní Groma in a particularly stricken part of the country. And she was sort of annoyed even with the church as well, that they were feeding them kind of false things, and what use was it to them when people were dying everywhere. And so there is a kind of desperation in this song. And in the way I treat it, I just use little shards of it, and they become these little kind of germs or cells, musical cells. And Iarla, the old man who sing it, sung by Iarla Ó Lionáird, is on a kind of desperation. But that desperation, as you say, resolves, but it resolves into this kind of beautiful overtone bass chord, which is like a sort of eating into the harmony. So, I mean, that's actually, it's a movement that I really, I suppose, I'm pleased with that. I mean, pleased is the wrong word to say, but there is a kind of sense in which there is a kind of process almost in the music that's eating through it, through that song.
And Black Potatoes, as powerful as it is, resolves into the next movement, which is keening, which is a lament for the dead, but it's very reserved, and this is the soprano singing most of it in Irish, actually. I assume it's a mother lamenting for her daughter, right? Yes,
mother lamenting for her daughter, and that's where Asenath basically crosses the threshold, that she's feeling that sympathy, and that's why she sings it. And that's based, actually, so those two parts, Black Potatoes and Keening, are the parts of the piece that are based on these source materials of the time. And there's a phenomenal rendition of Keening by the singer Kitty Gallagher, and that's how I came across that piece, and that forms the basis of that. And what I love about the Irish Keening tradition is that there's a kind of reserve to it too. There's a kind of restraint. You know, when you think also like of Irish dancing, people hold their back straight. And so this restraint was a really important quality for this piece, because I thought by having this kind of restraint, it keeps it from lapsing into melodrama, and in a way it hits you harder. That's what I felt. And then the keening, for example, which is quite gentle, but it's always sliding. The pitches are always sliding, also inside in the instrumental writing, then leads into probably the darkest part of the piece, which is Dreadful Winter, which is talking about one of the winters, and the winters were pretty fierce. Yeah.
And that's the ending that we talked about.
Yeah.
Well, the whole piece is so fascinating and really thought-provoking. And it's been just a pleasure to listen to. I hope that our listeners will certainly take the initiative to check it out. I've been speaking with Donnacha Dennehy, who is composer of the docu-cantata The Hunger. It's a meditation on the Great Famine in Ireland. This album features new music ensemble Alarm Will Sound under conductor Alan Pearson, also vocal soloists Katherine Manley and Iarla Ó Lionáird. It's available from Nonesuch Records. Donnacha, thank you so much for this music, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us about it today.
Thanks so much, Brad.